All right. I'm just gonna go ahead and start. Welcome everybody. I am so excited to be here with you today and alongside my amazing colleague, Jeremy. My name is Andrea Montiel de Shuman. I am an independent experience designer and a cultural advocate. I am Latina. I use she and her pronouns. My skin is brown. My hair is styled in a couple of braids. I'm speaking to you from Wyatanong, currently known as Detroit, Michigan. These wetlands have been historically cared for by Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Powhatami communities. My encouragement and question to you today is, do you know the local elders in your community? Do you know the different organizations that care for the indigenous local efforts? And have you asked the local elders in our community what they need? Okay, Jeremy.
All right. First off, Andrea, you can see my presentation, right? Awesome.
Yes.
Great. So I'm Jeremy Munro. I'm the database administrator at the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art. I'm a white man who's wearing a loud floral print shirt, and I'm wearing a baseball hat that says "Greet Death" on it. I'm a big fan of the summer goth aesthetic at all points. Today we're going to talk about museums in 3021 and whether museums can remain relevant or will be consigned to the dustbin of history. To start off, Andrea just did her land acknowledgement. I will do mine now. Long before I was born, the Nacotchtank people lived on the land now called Washington, District of Columbia. Since the arrival of Europeans, they and other indigenous communities have faced the loss of their land and destruction of their culture across what we now call the United States, North America, and South America. I cannot pay the scale of this debt myself, but I can give my solidarity, advocacy, and resources to support their communities and aims, and I encourage all others to do the same. After this presentation, I will be making a donation to the First Americans Museum in Oklahoma after this, and I strongly encourage others to donate in addition to their acknowledgement. The link is there at the below, or you could just Google the First Americans Museum. They have a big donate link. Secondly, I would also just like to acknowledge that enslaved Africans were brought to North America in the 1500s, but 1619 is often used as the beginning of slavery in the United States. On April 12th, 1861, Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter, South Carolina, igniting the Civil War. Enslaved people took up arms and seized their freedom, while 360,000 Union soldiers died fighting a separatist government which sought to use the prerogative of states' rights to uphold slavery. For all of American history, their descendants have faced structural and explicit racism. We will never have a better world so long as this continues. And finally, I would like to acknowledge that enslaved labor helped construct the original Smithsonian building, the Smithsonian Castle, which still stands on the National Mall. A really important thing to understanding our presentation today is understanding what a liminal place is. Liminal places are a bit of a meme online, but they're very real in the sense that they take up a lot of academic space. I'm using a definition from architecture, so the physical spaces between one destination and the next. We could debate whether museums are liminal places, but I think that museums are very much in a transition between one destination and the next, and it is very unclear what they will become.
And I think that one of the big questions of the confusion of trying to imagine the future is whatever the heck happened during 2020. We saw the news. According to the news, it was the year of accountability for museums. But was it actually like that? Next slide, please. See, during this global pandemic, what happened was not necessarily new. It was the exacerbation of the different situations that we were already experiencing here in the field. I think that gives us an idea about the future, but the response from museum institutions, I think it made us rethink what we thought was going to happen in the future. Next slide, please. So reality hits, and then institutions start sharing the response to or asks of better practices or asks of better treatment of employees. So how did they respond? Let's explore. Next slide, please. Before I even dive, I encourage you to dive into the Museum Workers Report 2021. It has been shared widely on Twitter. If somebody can pop into the comments a link to it, there are links to download it. I definitely encourage you to read through it. I'm not gonna steal their data. I'm gonna encourage you to read their data. But at least I do want to acknowledge that this is an excruciatingly painful story, clearly told, of how we were received, how our claims and or asks were received. Next slide, please. But you also saw all of the news floating around. There is celebration, all kinds of new museum unions. If you are part of a museum union, I want to honor you right now. I only put a couple of logos there. I wouldn't have enough space. During the last year, so many of you have unionized, but at the same time, we're seeing union busting activities, all kinds of tactics to fight against negotiation, even after a union has been accepted. Next slide, please. And then we also saw different types of retaliation. We saw the law firms. We saw the new hires in diversity, equity, and accessibility or inclusion. But we also saw some people from our own communities, if you are a person of color, being used kind of to defend pretty terrible practices. Next slide, please. All in all, we saw the full picture of narcissistic abuse. We saw that this is not something that we can negotiate out of. This is not a problem that we can just agree on and then move on. These tactics actually demand our loyalty and silence. It goes through retaliation, it acts through gaslighting. It segregates us pretty effectively. It makes us hopeless and it makes us a bit selfish. Next slide, please. So with all of this situation, can we even imagine a future for museum? What kind of future awaits for us? Next, please. See, we saw where the money is going, and I think that this is a good path to follow. Where is the money going? It's not going necessarily to get things better. It's not necessarily going so that we become better, so that we have better experiences, and so that the field suddenly fixes itself. That is not how this has been led. The story has been a bit different. Next slide, please. After I took a step back and I looked at all of the ways in which museums responded in the past year and in the past 20 years of different museum colleagues at all kinds of points asking for better practices, the bottom line is we are protecting the colonial practices and museums are still avoiding accountability at all costs. So welcome to 3021. How can we think of a future if we continue this exact path? I'm going to help imagine what I believe can happen if we continue to follow the path that we've been following so far. Next slide, please. I think that dog might give you part of the answer. Some of you have seen this dog playing all kinds of new games, dancing around. Well, this is where my fear goes. Let's say that somehow institutions are able to keep control, meaning they are able to control unions, they are able to control organizing, they're able to even spike up all kinds of retaliation and new types of surveillance. I imagine that in 3021, museum workers would look not that different, but maybe we will be made to work in very different ways. That's when I believe that artificial intelligence will play a big role. And that makes me pretty scared. I don't know about you. But then I also imagine that this world of museums, field of surveillance and with continuous retaliation, if it continues to avoid reflecting the context that it lives in, I believe that is the rest of society that might forget about museums. Some of you have theorized that maybe in a few years, there won't be a need for museums, that if we don't change, then why do we exist? What if do we want to keep on telling the stories of one another? So I imagine that if we do nothing about the situation, we might be doomed to irrelevance. This conversation can continue to go dark and dark and dark and dark. And we can go into a cycle of a dystopian future. But you know, sometimes I struggle a little bit to go that far because it already feels quite dystopian. I'm gonna let Jeremy dive into that.
So I want to open up this with a quote by cultural critic Austin Walker, who's talking about the video game Nier Automata, which is a game that's very seriously looking at the future and how whether or not the future is a cycle, and that also like what is the role of like what is not just like what like are robots people, but like what are people? So I'm just gonna read it. It's like, what the fuck are people? In the world where none of us can connect, none of us can ever really reach out and touch another person. At all points, that connection is mediated by language or by technology or by physical distance, or by the words we refuse to say to one another because we're scared, or by the words we're compelled to say to one another because of loyalty or anger. And all that connection is impossible. And also, it's all we can fucking do to try to connect with to each other. It's the only thing we can't stop trying to do is to find that deep human connection. Whether or not we were born as human or stumble into being it, that desire is what makes us human. And the biggest tragedies are when we try and fail to. So I want to open up with just the eternal question of museums, right? What is a museum? And I don't mean like the ICOM definition, right? I think that things like the ICOM definition of museums or any other kind of like AAM definition are attempting to look at institutions that already exist and then assign the label museum to them. I am more interested in what is a museum conceptually and philosophically. What is the role that it fits into human existence? And I don't even mean in the terms of like you go to it and you experience culture. I mean even a more philosophical than that. Like, what does it mean to have a museum, right? What does it mean that we have a word for museum? That we think that things should be stored in places. And so we already kind of talked about liminal spaces, but as a review, right? The physical spaces between one destination and the next. And again, liminal spaces are a bit of a meme. We see here a tweet, academics be like, I know a spot, and then take you to a liminal place. So I want to talk about the promise of a liminal space, right? So it's a liminal space is a place in between. It feels like anything can happen. What happens when we go underground, physically or mentally? Can we emerge somewhere else, somewhen else, as someone else? I read books about people who travel through, explore caves, for example, and they talk about the sheer disorienting of being in a cave and the feeling of emerging, that you've come out into a new world, even that you exited right where you entered. So let's talk about non-places. Can you imagine a non-place, a placeless place, a place without space, a place where place and the idea of a non-place can coexist or not exist? Can we enter such a place? What would happen if you opened a door and it went somewhere else? One time I opened a door and it went out to my street, but the street was different than before. It was redacted. The void was there. Was it the abyss, or was it the great chasm at the heart of the universe? Maybe it was art. Maybe it was also theater. Maybe it was all the times I could have helped people, but I didn't. Maybe it was my regrets. Either way, the memory is gone, plucked out of my brain. And now every time I open doors, I pray it will go somewhere else, or that I'll get in a car or on a train. And when we go into the tunnel, we'll emerge in some, and everything else was a dream, and the good times will no longer be some halcyon memory of your non-place, not a place, but also a place, because a non-place is a thing, and in anything inhabits a place. Doesn't it? Maybe the computer goes to liminal places. Maybe the screen will suck me in and I'll just be a bunch of bits and bytes until it eats me out at the other end of some other when. But if a museum is a place, could it also be a non-place? Could a non-place house art? Is a non-place art or history or an archive? What if the non-places of the world are archives, placeless places housing spaceless knowledge? Perhaps the museum is all in our heads, literally existing in our heads as some kind of mad fever dream. Perhaps Museum Digital is a non-place, some den of weirdos that like to walk around brutalist architecture at night and look at a trash can and go, is this a liminal space? Non-places like these should be weirder. Maybe we should make weird stuff. Maybe when we make weird stuff, we make cool stuff. And then the non-places can go back to being yes places. So that was weird, right? Sometimes weird signals come across these internet waves. Anyways, back to regular scheduled programming. So speculative structure from what I'm going to talk about here. I'm going to talk about kind of three types of culture. The culture of consumption, the culture of stewardship, and the culture of extraction. and the possible futures that these lead towards. Some of these I took very much from Barry Lord's book, Art and Energy. He specifically talks about culture of consumption and culture of stewardship. I thought about how I think we've actually, the culture of consumption isn't quite accurate for what we live in now. And then instead we live in the culture of extraction, which I'll get to. But first I want to do a note on binaries, because Andrea and I are really peddling, and we're very much doing the binary thing here, right? We're like, could museums end up good or could museums end up bad? But we're outlining two paths, but they're not exclusive. Binaries reduce complexity, and that the real future is always going to be some middle ground between these. But ultimately, these are the forces that we see pushing and pulling on each other. And that I want to remind folks that the ideal world or the dystopian world are useful because they're abstractions that can teach us about the present, but they're never going to come to pass. You know, there's a tendency to read dystopian literature and be like, oh my gosh, I could see this is going to happen. And it's like, it's never going to happen. You know, our lives have so much more complexity and nuance to them. So, you know, Barry Lord's main thesis in Art and Energy is that culture in a given era is tied to that society's energy source. And he talks about, historically, you see the culture of transformation. So we're talking about like the late 1800s to early 1900s, electrification, rapid development, new inventions coming out. You know, 1 minute you have the telegram, next minute you have the telephone, you know. But then after World War II, he says that we're in a culture of anxiety, which reflects the rise of nuclear power, the ability to destroy literally the entire planet in a moment. And that generated a lot of anxiety. And I didn't say it great with the culture of transformation. Obviously, that maps onto the rise of like literally electrification, literally power being a thing. And so culture of consumption is kind of what he says we live in now. And it's not, to me, it's not just the consumption of goods or resources, but the consumption of experiences, right? So what does that consumption imply? So I see two kind of angles of consumption in museum structures that exist right now, and I think will probably continue to exist in the future. So at their core, museums seek to consume time. So, i.e., we bring in visitors and they spend their time at museums. And I don't even mean that in like a cynical way, like, oh, museums want to like waste your time or whatever. But I just mean that's like a fact of anything you do in your life that wants you to show up, people are consuming your time. And we like that a number that's bigger is better than the small number. And then there's also consumption in the museum experience itself, right? Visitors come in and they consume our exhibitions, they consume our digital interactives, they consume our social media. And I think what's interesting, when we use the word consume, we don't often mean that like it's a healthy thing, right? You know, when usually consuming implies some negative. It's worth reflecting on that. So I wanted to reframe the culture of consumption as a culture of extraction, actually, which is to say that in our culture, we do an extreme extraction of physical resources, right? Not just metal or oil. I want people to start thinking about how we consume land. And I don't even just mean that like stealing indigenous people's land, which is absolutely a thing that has happened and continues to happen, but also like land in your built environment around you, right? That we live in these big sprawl where there's no community, it's hard to access resources, and that we consume land in the sake of building these big house castles on them, essentially, and then driving these castle cars around places. Like, you know, everybody's a little feudal lord, which is a very extractive mode. And that the museum is extractive of objects, right? Like at its core, museums take in objects, and that's extractive, especially if in the formal sense of them stealing them from communities potentially. So there's also the extraction of time, right? We all are pretty familiar with the attention economy at this point, and I just talked about time. But I also want people to start thinking about the extraction of data, which is not just surveillance, which Andrea talked about very well, but also we extract our digital selves, right? So like right now, there's a bunch of data that is called Jeremy Munro that exists on a bunch of different data centers in North America and probably in other parts of the world. Like I'm very active on Twitter. So wherever the Twitter data center is, like a non-zero amount of myself is living. Because I would encourage you to not think of you as being just like the body and the brain, but that like your journals, like if you have journals, I have a bag in my closet with all my journals in them. That's also me, because there's memories in there and I don't really have access to those. So you've used a very reductionist thing. I'm not a big Harry Potter fan, but like the pensive from Harry Potter, right? You literally are taking memories out of you and putting them elsewhere. I mean, also I want to note that the extraction of data disproportionately hurts the poorest among us and people of color. It's been proven that, for example, a lot of companies that seek to monopolize people of color are also very, very roughshod with their data. People of color are much more likely to be victims of identity theft, and that this cuts across race and class. So finally, I want to talk about the culture of stewardship, which is kind of like the hopeful trend, which is that hopefully we end up somewhere near here. And this accompanies renewable energy. And this is straight from Barry Lord. And that creates, the culture of stewardship has values of local engagement, preservation, sustainability, and I think most importantly, transparency. I'm somebody who thinks that transparency is pretty much the #1 thing that museums should be doing, because I think when you have a culture that's transparent, I think the rest of that stuff comes. And so another lens with the culture of stewardship is solar punk. And this slide is just ripped from my Ignite presentation. So if you saw that, I'm just copying that. But it's sci-fi, which assumes that humanity solves the climate problems that it faces today, and that technology is something to be used only when it is of mutually agreed upon benefit. And it's focused towards global justice and not just green living for those who can afford it, which is something like intensely frustrating to me, in that, something I didn't get to expound on in my Ignite, but I'll use this opportunity to, is that in the future, I hope that we stop thinking about the environment as something that's either only your personal responsibility, right? Like, don't use plastic straws, or, oh my God, I need to find a place to recycle this can that I drank at work. Or on the other end, that it's specifically only the problem of rich people and corporations who seem to be polluting the planet in this like Captain Planet villain way, because it's both. We have an individual responsibility where we can and where it makes sense and where it's economically feasible for us to do so. But we also have a responsibility, but also the powers that be and the systems that we create and the people in charge of them have a responsibility to take care of the planet. And so I just don't want people to ever think that those are, again, binaries are bad. So now I'll turn it back to Andrea.
You see, it was so fascinating when a couple of people from MCN asked Jerina and I to collaborate in this presentation, which actually comes out of our Ignite presentation. But we realized we have a lot of things in common about our perspectives about the future. But I will say that I was struggling in one sense. The original presentation started with the question what 3021 could look like, both from the perspective of what I was proposing, which was healing, and from Jeremy's perspective. And I have to be honest with you. In the past year, I got to the point where it was really hard to imagine the future, almost impossible for me. And I was remembering when I was a child, my dad, a big lover of science fiction, had a collection of magazines, and I wonder if there's anybody familiar with them. It would be amazing if any of you are, but they were called Quest. And the magazine Quest was exploring what the future technologies could be like, what the future around space exploration could look like. I distinctively remember the ways of communication that were suggested. It was this tiny little pencil-looking pendant that people will carry. And that eventually transformed in the idea of how to communicate with one another. So that was kind of like one of the early sketches from somebody who imagined cell phone communications. So I was finally able to ask myself in the past few weeks, even though I cannot clearly imagine a future for museums the way it is right now, or even though I wasn't able to, can I start to imagine what it would look like if we face the biggest piece that I think is our obstacle right now, which is our trauma? And I started to see some things. Next slide, please. I started to see a future where actually we take an opportunity to heal. And healing, although you might not think that it translates into technology, I believe that it does. I believe that healing will lead us to courageous sacrifices, to courageous movements. You see, all of the incredible technologies and possibilities that Jeremy suggests, I believe are only possible if the people collaborate with one another to make those realities happen. Because I don't believe that the people who are in place right now actually have the motivation or the need to change. So if the people in charge don't have the inspiration or the need to change, how can we push them? That's where I believe that courageous sacrifices will be taken. That's where I believe that a future of stewardship is actually possible. If we collaborate to advocate for one another, I believe that there is a possibility to redesign our reality, even to the extent of starting to develop empathetic tech. What does that even look like? Next slide, please. I think that the reason why I was finally able to imagine a future is because of what you see on your screen. Yes, my own path of resigning, I just was so fed up. But then I observe what people have been able to do, even despite the constraints of today's age. I believe that Shade Beer changed my limitations of what I thought was possible. I believe that the Museum Workers Relief Fund changed my perspective of what was possible. I believe that the movement of museums are not neutral is changing that perspective. So although I can only draw what I saw in those Quest magazines many, many years ago, I can at least start to sketch. I can start to sketch. And I get the idea that we can go in a good path if we commit to healing. Next slide, please. I believe in a future of healing and well-being. I believe that if we are able to break the barriers, we will take control of the situation. I don't think that it will be easy, and I'm not gonna sell that idea. I just don't believe that we need every single person for this. I think that a small bunch is powerful enough. Next slide, please.
So I just want to pose a question for everybody to kind of conclude this a little bit. What if all the doors and staircases and nighttime drives or train tunnels or night buses all go to the same places, some network of places in memory that move between all of us? What if what we'd find there was all the memories we stored away, or we'd find the things we forgot, or the things we were forced to leave behind? Maybe that's what 3021 is.
See, there's an invitation here. It was a year ago that I was invited by an artist, a local Anishinaabe artist. And he started telling me about a practice that he does with his community. And I started adapting that practice. And I think it makes sense for this. They were using daydreaming as an act of liberation. I believe that we're in a liminal space, that we are in a moment of transition, and we can start imagining a different future, even if it doesn't make sense.
You can find us at your favorite staircase to nowhere, favorite dead mall where you got dumped in an eternal Y2K. There's our Twitters. We'll take questions now. I'm going to stop sharing so that way I can see everybody.
I do want to mention a really good point that Tim mentions. I will read it. It says, unbridled transparency without care and diligence can be as damaging and unbridled security, though, what it is to care for objects and items that museums hold in ways that honor traditional and indigenous ways of stewardship and care. That may require restrictions. For example, certain songs and words are traditionally only meant for elders. Or wahin, my apologies if in case of mispronunciation. Engaging in that conversation is an open and transparent, in an open and transparent way is vital, but what it is manifested may not be, from a Western perspective, be transparent. I 100% agree, and I have actually seen a lot of harm being done when transparency is done without care. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I wouldn't say you're doing good transparency if you're violating that kind of stuff. It's pretty simple. Yeah, folks have any questions, please sound off.
Yeah, we both believe in all kinds of possibilities. It's really interesting. We just got talking about all kinds of science fiction. Is there any type of science fictions that inspired any of the audiences that are listening right now into thinking of potential futures? Feel free to comment.
Yeah, actually, at Better World Museum and Horizon Art Museum, we use virtual reality world building. We pay diverse women and LGBTQ members to learn how to use primary shapes, gizmos, and simple scripts to create installations and worlds that are centered around amplifying voices, letting go, healing. Each of our lessons has a theme like amplify voice or letting go or fear of flying. And we teach these members, our goal is to teach 1,500 women in the next 6 months how to build these worlds and then track them using different metrics to see what kind of community leadership roles they develop independently in the groups and communities that they're part of. This is all in a VR platform inside of an Oculus Rift. And if you have interest in participating, I will give you an access pass if you're 18 or older in United States and Canada. Please reach out. I will do everything I can to have you make sure you have access to this platform if you have an Oculus headset. I don't work for Facebook, but I created my own museum because of the personal trauma that I've experienced. The environment you see around me was created by collaborative community builders who created a world surrounding domestic abuse, resilience during this month of domestic violence survivors. So there are ways that you can use technology and futurist world building to create community and amplify voices today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Much appreciated for that. Something else I would, on that last note of like creating communities, something that I think a lot about for museums in the future is how do we create communities that create any amount of the passion that you see in like any small internet community dedicated to like a video game or like any small musical artist or something like that, where like, you know, people will just run up whole fan discords and stuff like that, you know. It looks like Anna has their hand up.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for your talk and inspiration, and it's something we always are in, no? What is the future of museums? And so many promises come from the technology in a lot of articles, no? What technology can do for people. I'm Ana Martí. I come from the Polytechnical University in Valencia, Spain, and I'm the coordinator of REMED, a network of museums and digital strategies for Latin American museums and Spanish-speaking countries. So from this, I did my PhD on augmented reality and museums. And I was inspired in many films and science fiction because, in my opinion, we need to go out from screens and go inside technology from a more natural approach, more natural behave. And so these old promises of digital technology are always in background. I mean, it's not real at all, no? What happened with social networks? I mean, culture is always increases. Sometimes I think about it, and people that look at us and people that really use museums is quite limited. And we always try to open it up to a wider audience instead of getting advance of what the community can be, also if it is small, or what we can do for the perception with all that. So about what Jeremy was saying, why not in 2035 or in the next future, we can have those communities interacting with technology or with other people more related to an artifact or an issue or flower or whatever it is that really makes sense. for all of us. And because of the pandemic, we are more related to physical objects, no? Because we are tired of the screens, we are tired of technology. So as the, in my opinion, culture is increases always, and museums are increases always, and will be for the many years in the future. But the power of the physical objects and the power of collections, in my opinion, if we think in the future, it will get stronger. And I think museums have an important role in that.
Thank you.
Opinion.
Thank you. I appreciate that comment. That made me also think about, like, something I would encourage people to think about too, is that museums take it for granted that they should exist. This is something my new director at the African Art Museum said to us, is like, she is asking, like, why does an African art museum exist as part of the federal government of the United States? Like, just like as a question, right? Like, there's good answers for why it does, but nonetheless, we should be asking ourselves that. And the same thing goes with tech and museum digital, which I think is like, why, you know, this is the why museums track, but also like, why digital? Like, why are we using X technology in Y way? And instead, as you pointed out, could we use technologies to touch on different segments of visitors that, you know, we're not serving as well, instead of just trying to pitch a big tent all the time. So yes.
Agree. I want to lift a comment from Sue's. Jeremy and Andrea, how essential do you think it is to look to the past and museum stories to understand the institution in order to imagine towards the future? Is it helpful, limiting? I actually have thoughts about this. I think that it can be both. I think that it is essential that we dismantle how we've told stories historically, because I do think that we can see the patterns of why leadership and museums have taken decisions on how to portray certain stories, how certain collections have been chosen to be the ones exhibited, why certain collections have been hidden in obscure areas of the museum for decades and centuries. I do think that all of that is crucial, understand why the museum is the way it is. But I also think it's limited in this way. I think that in the past year, we saw what happens when leadership suddenly says, yes, we need to do better. But all they talk about is the sentence, we need to do better, and we're working on it. And they might be repeating the same arguments around the need for diversity and equity and accessibility and inclusion. But I think that at this point, they are stuck there. We are past that. We are now talking about trauma-informed care, while some leadership are still going on and on and on about a specific aspect. So I think that when it's detrimental is when resources are so dedicated to a specific subject that it blinds all of the necessities that of what we need to do.
Yeah, my other way I would approach that question too, regarding the past, is that, you know, I'm a trained historian, like, you know, so I love the past. I'm going to be finishing up a 900-page book about Ulysses S. Grant after this presentation. Very stoked about it. But also, when it comes to museums, I think the past is really great for narrative, right? Past gives us all the good stories for why we're here and all of the things that have happened in the past. But that narrative in museums is often used to keep us from changing. And that's my big concern, is that the stories that we tell ourselves in museums, not just as employees, but like the stories of museums being valuable inherently. It's like, again, like I am just asking, why do we have museums? Like, why are there objects? Why do we feel like we need to put them in a hall and go look at them, rather than, like, you know, there's objects in my room right now, but my room is not an exhibition, you know, like these are just kind of questions that keep me up at night sometimes. Also, yeah. Like, Susie, if you want to like talk about that more, please do.
To be honest, so I'm teaching a course on history and theory at the moment, and I was going through my readings for tomorrow whilst doing the session, and a lot of what I've been thinking about for tomorrow's class actually comes from this idea of how we understand history also then leads to the risk of repeating history. So the argument is often that if you forget the past, you'll repeat it. And I almost think it's flipped on that actually we remember the past, it becomes the narrative that then we understand as being natural or assumed in some ways, and therefore that leads to repeating something. That looking at histories of domination and oppression, for instance, then become writ into expectations. And so thinking about then how we move to a history where we're not repeating the same structures and systems. I'm really curious as to the role of history within that, because I think that's important for us as cultural institutions and historical institutions, but also how we break those structures and cycles.
Thank you. That makes total sense. And it also makes me think of the necessity of multiple perspectives. Mm-hmm. I think that multiple perspectives is an approach that I very much encourage. Because I think that even thinking of history, we can ask the questions, whose history? Like, who wrote this? You know, who is it for? Because a lot of times when we say art history, that's not telling my story necessarily. It might be touching on some points, but I do see value into taking a step back and reconsidering even how we place that timeline on art history. But I will also say at the same time that it can be a tactic to stay where we are and not move. I've seen it being a tactic.
I would also say that, like, you know, history is rife with quotes essentially saying what you were just saying, which is to say that, like, you know, there's the Ursula Le Guin quote. It's like, you know, the divine right of kings seemed unassailable until it wasn't. And, you know, Lenin saying, you know, sometimes decades happen in days, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Or like Mark Fisher's capitalist realism is something I revisit a lot, where capitalism specifically makes us think that it frames what is possible, and it's very difficult to step outside of those bounds. So I was just thinking about that as you said that. It's just like, it's very funny that there's this, you know, as you said, it's flipped. You know, history is, you know, we think that knowing history will make us not doomed to repeat it, yet we repeat it all the time. And yet it is also kind of poetically very funny that there is a long history of people saying that, and that we can then pull those quotes all the time and point them out to people in a conference session, you know? I don't know. Sometimes I just find life more, there's this Dostoevsky quote that's like, I want to find, oh crap, I'm going to forget it. To love life in spite of the meaning of it. And I like to find the absurdity here.
Oh, I see that we are 3 minutes out. So before we continue, I do want to lift Tim's comment that I think is so important. He does mention that artifacts in museums, it's unfortunate that they're seen as the default of culture. And it is true that for Indigenous cultures, artifacts are often part of the process. One example where this was very real is a couple of, one of my Anishinaabe artist friends pointed out that at my institution, there are drums that should have never been part of a wall, that those drums belong to the forest, to the wetlands, and that according to her own community, once those drums will be used, then they will be given back to nature. That's just an example of how, you know, museums have reinterpreted how they're supposed to be using objects. I definitely want to thank each one of you for participating in this conversation. I was so excited to collaborate with Jeremy. On my behalf, thank you very much. I don't know, Jeremy, if you have any last words.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everybody for attending. I know virtual conference was tough this year. It has been for me. I've been having to just perform my job while also attempting to attend, which kind of sucks. And so it was great that folks came out, and looking forward to hopefully seeing everybody in person next year, where we can just really be weird, hopefully. In the meantime, I hope you stay safe, and you know, I wish you much more than luck.
Cheers. Thank you.